Hey, you guys want to know what I think is awesome? New York City, come on guys, give it up, my hometown crowd. Okay, you want to know what else I think is awesome? Print. My God, print is amazing. Like, what a fantastic technology. I mean, you put the words on the paper and they stay there. You don't have to worry about keeping it updated all the time. So print, like when you really look back at the history of human communication, the 500 years we have of the printing press and the thousands of years that came before that of the written word, so much of our culture and values and processes for what it means to communicate are all derived from what it took to put ink on paper. And then we had to go and invent the web. Which, I don't know, I mean, on balance, I think it's been totally worth it, but I mean, man, is it a pain in the ass. So the web just turned 25 years old. And I'm like a huge nerd for computing history. And so when you look back at the very foundations of where the web started, the earliest technologies of HTML, hypertext markup language, and the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator, these tools were designed from the start with the explicit intent that anyone, anywhere, could create a document that could be accessible globally and updated instantaneously. And when you kind of take a step back from like the work that we do every day and just kind of appreciate just how transformational that is in the history of human communication, I mean, just how different the web is from everything that came before, it's like 25 years is barely enough time for humankind to have wrapped our head around the way that the web is different. And so we've spent the last quarter century just kind of like band-aiding ourselves along, just kind of using some training wheels where we told everybody, well, I mean, a web page, it's really just like a printed page. I mean, you can just imagine that the web page is sort of like a piece of paper. And then came the rise of mobile. And so now we have people accessing the web through a range of different devices. And mobile, when I talk about the challenge of publishing on mobile, what I mean is that mobile has forced us to give up our shared hallucination, that we have any control over the size screen that somebody has, or the input mechanism that they're using, or how much bandwidth they have. And it's that challenge with the rise of mobile and now with tablet devices, like it's the fact that we no longer have the luxury of making assumptions. And that is gone, and it's not coming back. And so to me, this is the real transition. When I talk about content strategy for mobile, I don't mean like, what's your strategy for getting your stuff onto smartphones or marketing to mobile users? What I mean is, how do we adapt our publishing processes? How do we adapt the very way that we think about how we communicate and how we talk to people about the content creation process to understand that now our content has to live on a wide range of devices and platforms? And to look at it from this vantage point right now, I think it's still easy to fall into the trap of going, okay, well, but smartphones and tablets and desktop, they're still, I mean, maybe it's a squishy piece of paper, but it's still really just a piece of paper, right? So I'm not a futurist here, okay? I'm not here to predict for you what I think the next big thing is going to be. But I am going to tell you one thing, I'll guarantee it. There is going to be a next big thing. And whatever that next big thing is, we're going to have to get our stuff onto it. Maybe it'll be smart TV. So a lot of people hypothesizing that the next big wave is going to be how we get our stuff into the living room. And when you start thinking about all of these different form factors, I mean, to me, this idea really drives home the fact that it's a fallacy, that we can make any assumptions at all about screen size, resolution, capabilities, characteristics, input device. I mean, the opportunity here isn't to say, oh, well, how can we just treat the smart TV like it's a bigger piece of paper? The opportunity here is to say, how do we think about publishing our content in a way that doesn't rely on us having to imagine that this is just the same thing as before? Or, I don't know, maybe the next big thing is going to be in-car systems. So, I don't know about you guys, but I live here. I don't drive a car. The idea of drivers going around with a touchscreen on their dashboard is terrifying to me. But that's the thing. With in-car systems, the opportunity here isn't actually having a touchscreen on your dashboard. The opportunity here is an interconnected ecosystem of perhaps having some kind of controls, but also having an audio interface that you can use to have things read to you and navigate using both a combination of touch and voice. And so this starts to open up all kinds of possibilities where you realize that one day the Star Trek computer is going to become a reality. And I know it's pretty easy to laugh at this right now, right? I mean, it's like we've all had the experience of using Siri or, God forbid, one of those like interactive voice touch phone things. It's terrible, right? Audio interfaces right now are terrible. You know what else used to suck? Touchscreens. Touchscreens were awful. You remember going to the ATM and having to like angle your finger just right to get the button to push? For decades, touchscreens were seen as this almost ran technology that was never quite going to reach prime time. And then one day, touchscreens worked. They worked perfectly. And it transformed our entire industry in the space of like 5 years. So I don't know when touchscreen, or when audio interfaces are really going to become a reality. 5 years, 15 years, 50 years. But I guarantee you, when the Star Trek computer is a reality, when I go up and ask that computer a question, the last thing I want to hear is it to start reading http:// back at me. And so when you realize like what this means for the actual way that we create content and produce our code, like for example, I've had developers come to me and ask, Karen, why do we have to bother parsing out the difference between what is rendered as emphasis and what is rendered as italics, when every major browser since the dawn of time has rendered emphasis as italics? Not in an audio interface, they don't. One of those things conveys visual styling. The other conveys meaning. In an audio interface, emphasis conveys tone of voice. And so when you start peeling back what this means for how we create content, you start to realize that doing the right thing for creating content for the future actually means doing the right thing for accessibility today. And if you don't believe me on this, check out what Google is doing with what they call their conversation group. So Google is a company that can make cars that drive themselves. And that's not even their core business. That's just some weird side project they cooked up. But no, the conversation group, the idea of how human beings communicate with technology through language, that is squarely Google's core business. And they are investing really heavily in coming up with ways to enable people to communicate with computers through their voice. So if that's the next big thing, then maybe the next big thing's going to be Google Glass. I don't really think Google Glass is going to be the next big thing. I think Google Glass is like the Segway of mobile. It's like a Segway, but for your face. But, OK, it's easy to mock Google Glass. But what I don't mock is the very idea that wearables will become a real part of the future. I worked with this industrial products catalog company recently. So they produce industrial parts that would be used in factories. And they put out this huge, just this enormous printed catalog. And I went and talked to them, and I said, look, I'm not going to tell you when you will stop printing that catalog. I mean, it might be 5 years from now, it might be 15 years from now. But I guarantee you the day will come when you will make the decision to no longer print that catalog. And when that day comes, the idea that your audience, these people who work on the factory floor, that they might be more likely to have a wearable device than they would be to want to, say, walk back to their office and use a desktop computer, I think that's a reality. And so what do you have to do, starting right now, today, to get your publishing process in a place so that when you stop printing that printed catalog and you start having to publish to Wearables, you can do it? Because right now, your entire publishing process is geared toward how you get that ink on paper. And what you're going to have to do differently for whatever device might come down the pipe, you need to start thinking about that now. So maybe not Google Glass. Maybe it's watches. Everybody's talking about watches, right? Galaxy Gear, the Pebble, the rumored iWatch. So a lot of times when I talk about watches, people are like, oh, Karen, watches, so tiny. Can't be the next big thing. I mean, who really wants to read a long document on their watch, right? Probably not. But when you think of the watch as existing in a larger ecosystem of devices, that the watch is the controller for your smart TV, that the watch enables you to control, navigate through information that then is read to you through an audio interface, you realize that even if our content does not have to be fully rendered on every device type, it still has to be accessible and navigable from every device type. And so we need to have processes in place to ensure that what we're publishing makes sense, even on the smallest form factors. But, I mean, I get it. Watches, so tiny. Clearly not the next big thing. Maybe the next big thing is going to be stadium scoreboards. Come on, guys. We can get our content where everybody can see it. This is a joke. I put this in here as a joke because I was like, oh, it'll be funny because watches are tiny and then scoreboards are huge. And then I turned around and I talked to a client that said that the biggest problem that they are facing today is digital signage. It's a university client. It's actually SVA right here in Manhattan. And I talked to them and they said they just purchased all of these new screens, these new digital signs that they wanted to put up all over campus. And so they wanted a way to manage and maintain their content in one place and have it automatically publish out to their website, to their mobile app, and to these new digital screens. And I was like, hey, have you thought about treating the digital signs as a completely separate workflow and managing them as their own silo? And they were like, Karen, ain't nobody got time for that. No. When we have campus alerts or events listings or information for students, we want a way for that content to exist and for us to manage it and for it to automatically publish out to 3 very different form factors with 3 very different design requirements. This isn't some crazy futuristic dystopia that these people are living in. This is a real problem that they are trying to solve right now today. So, and digital signage is something that many organizations in the enterprise are going to be wrestling with. Maybe you too one day will be trying to solve the same problem on the internet refrigerator in your home. Come on, guys. We can't talk about the future without talking about the internet refrigerator, right? I mean, personally, I think the biggest problem facing our society today is that I can't check Twitter in the 30 seconds it takes me to get a Diet Coke. Okay, I don't really think the internet refrigerator is where it's at. But obviously, the idea that our homes will also become a network of interconnected sensors and devices, and that there may be screens on which we want to access or navigate information. Heck, what if it's not the refrigerator? What if instead it's that your entire cooktop, the glass cooktop of your stove, has an embedded iPad interface, and you can navigate through recipes or videos or news information right there from your cooking space? Or, and I do think that this is the biggest problem facing our society today, what happens when toaster printers become a reality? Is your content going to be ready to be burned onto delicious toast? These are the problems that we're here to solve together. So right now, today, Organizations are already faced with the challenge of getting their content onto a variety of different platforms. They have the web and now apps. They're wrestling with mobile apps, smartphone apps versus tablet apps. They've got to get their content onto blogs or in email or social channels. Heck, some of them are still trying to figure out how to get it onto print. And tomorrow, it will be a veritable zombie apocalypse of new devices and platforms and screen sizes and resolutions and input mechanisms, and they're just going to keep coming, and it's not going to stop. And so the real question becomes, how do we protect ourselves from the zombies? How do we protect ourselves knowing that we can't simply battle every zombie as it comes, that they're coming too quickly? We can't wrestle them by insisting that we have to have a uniquely siloed workflow for publishing to every single channel. And so protecting ourselves from the zombies means that we have to think differently about what our publishing process means. And for this, I think this really gets to the heart of what the challenge of mobile actually means for publishing. And that is the true separation of content from form. And so we have to support too many form factors to assume that we can tightly couple what it is that we are publishing with what it looks like. Do you have any idea how different this is in the way that people communicate? I mean, when you look back across all of human communication, and you think about this medieval monk laboriously hand-scribing documents, for us to go to him and suggest that we have a conversation about what it means to communicate the meaning of that document without tying that to any particular form factor or visual styling information that's embedded in that document, it wouldn't make any sense. I mean, there's just no way, there's no purpose of even having that conversation, because up until this point in history, every document that we produced, the meaning was so tightly intertwined with the way that it looked, with its form, that it wasn't even worth discussing. And yet today, when I talk about mobile, when I talk about having all of these different form factors, when I talk about this zombie apocalypse of devices, that is precisely the problem we need to solve. How can we ensure that the meaning, the essence, the semantic information that is embedded in that document is not purely tied to visual styling? And so when I say we have to separate content from form, it's real easy, especially when I talk to an audience of developers, it's real easy to think that what I mean is HTML. Like, get your HTML out of my content. And that's part of it, but it's really only the beginning. When Dan Jacobson, so he's the API guy from Netflix, he's formerly at NPR, when he says that the future of content management systems is in their ability to capture the content in a clean, presentation-independent way, it's tempting to reduce this to a problem with markup, to think that we can solve this problem by getting rid of rich text editors in our interfaces. And I will say, I am one of the industry's leading advocates for saying we should not be giving content creators a tool that encourages them to think about publishing to the web as if it's a piece of paper, where they get a giant blob where they can dump whatever they want into it. And we give them a toolbar at the top that mimics the familiar what you see is what you get interface. And we tell them, oh, sure, well, you can put a table in there and add some custom bullets, and you can take a box and float it to the right if you want. And then when it comes time to take this information and put it on any other platform, all of these decisions, all of this styling information has to be stripped out. The problem is that styling information isn't just there for decoration. Like, those content creators intended to communicate something with their styling choices. The person who floated that box to the right, they didn't really mean, I want a box floated to the right. What they meant was, I want this box to be set off from the content. It's just that the tools that we have given them, the language that we have to communicate that, forces them to continue to think of it as a visual styling tool rather than as embedding what they mean. And so when I get frustrated by this, when I get frustrated by the limitations of blobs, I rail against these kind of WYSIWYG interfaces on the web. And as a result, I've gotten the reputation as being like the president of the WYSIWYG haters club. And I want you guys to know, I'm like really kind of proud of this. My graffiti crime spree is going exceptionally well. It's nice to get the message out and conversations like this one, but the graffiti, it reaches a much wider audience. So sometimes when I say this, like developers will come up to me and they'll be like, yeah, Markdown's the answer. And I'm like, well, the problem's not the toolbar exactly. I mean, I don't care if somebody has a toolbar at the top of their screen that allows them to push a button to embed some formatting. No, the problem with WYSIWYG is that it relies on an outdated mental model that is derived from print to communicate to people what it means to publish on the web. You know where WYSIWYG came from? It came from Xerox. It came from Xerox PARC. Because they invented the laser printer. Now, think about this for a minute, okay? Up until this point, Xerox machines could only make a copy of a document that already existed. Xerox invented a way that you could print out whatever you wanted. But they needed a way for you to actually be able to create that document. And so Xerox invented the entire concept of the what you see is what you get interface. They invented the entire concept of the graphical user interface, which drove the rise of adoption of the personal computer, which directly led to the rise of the web. All of us here today have jobs because people bought personal computers because they wanted a laser printer. And I feel like I can say with a great deal of respect for what this mental model, what this metaphor has given us over the past 40 years or so, I can say with a great deal of respect and also acknowledge that the web is not a laser printer. My God, the web has nothing in common with a laser printer. There is no reality of what someone is doing or publishing on the web that is anything like printing out a document on the laser printer next to your desk. And yet, the tools that we give content creators are directly derived from that antiquated metaphor from the desktop publishing era that we use to communicate to people that it was like printing out a Word document. Ted Nelson says, imitating paper on a computer screen is like tearing the wings off of a 747 and using it as a bus on the highway. The web is better. The web can do so much more. And yet, we are still grounding content creators in this antiquated mental model that doesn't allow them to take advantage of all of the ways that the web is different. We are fighting a war here, people. We are fighting a war of blobs versus chunks. Blobs are these messy, formatting-dependent, embedded clumps of stuff where all of the meaning of that text, meaning of the document, is so tightly intertwined with what it looks like that we cannot reasonably take it to any other platform without having to do a significant amount of manual rework in order to communicate again in another context what that content creator intended. Whereas chunks are clean, presentation-independent bits of content that have been designed from the start that they can and will live on a variety of different platforms because the semantic meaning and the structure behind them is intended to translate wherever it needs to go. And so to fight this war, we need to get away from what I like to think of as container-first thinking. And it's so easy for us to fall into this. I mean, when you look back at the history of how we communicated in print, why the simplest possible thing to do would be to figure out what the page is, to draw a box around the thing that you were making. And so that's why when you open up Photoshop, the first thing it asks you is how big do you want the canvas to be? That's why when my dear friend Ethan Marcotte describes his process on the Boston Globe, he says we started out by identifying common breakpoints. And to Ethan's credit here, by the way, he also will remind you all, don't do this. It's why people are now trying to claim that cards are the future of the web. Cards! They're like pages, but tiny. And this is something, it's like when you come from a design perspective, you realize that, okay, yes, we like to think container first, but you know what? This often goes right down into the very bowels of the CMS. I'm working with a client right now where I get to look at a lot of companies' content management underpants, and so I get to go rummaging around in there, and I was like, hey, can you guys send me a list of all your content types? And they're like, sure, and I get this list, and it's like, I don't know, guys. Some of these things are not like the others. I mean, at the very foundation of how they describe what their content types are, what they are publishing, they mix the idea of, well, we publish FAQs or press releases or articles with the idea that we publish accordions or carousels or wrappers. One of these things are content types. The other are display types. And yet, we honestly, even in the systems that we have, don't have a good way to separate them. And the way that those things get separated is a process that is called content modeling, okay? Content modeling is what makes possible the much heralded NPR, create once, publish everywhere, COPE model. Content modeling is what allows my client SVA to have their digital screens and also have their web page, and to have the objects that are attached on this web page render appropriately on a different screen. And I can totally imagine, I can look at a web page like this and imagine that everything is managed as one giant blob, which would limit them because there would be no way for them to pull out the time and date of the event, or the short summary of the event, or the image attached to the event, and then have that render appropriately in a different way on that screen if all of that was stored as one giant blob in their CMS. It's what makes possible this example from The Guardian. So here, this is the Guardian's beta site. They have stories that are shown with an image and a short summary, and then at a smaller breakpoint, they remove the image. Here, they've got a row of 4 stories, images and summary, images and headline. And at a smaller breakpoint, just for the 2 most important stories, they keep the image, they get rid of it for the secondary stories. This is a simple example, but you realize that, oh, if we want to have the right hierarchy, the right granularity in our responsive designs so that we can render the right amount and priority of information so that it works well across a variety of breakpoints, we're going to need to make sure that that granularity is baked into our content creation process. And so the content modeling process involves first figuring out what type of content you have. Is it an article, a product spec, a recipe? Is it a medical condition, a radio program? I worked with a client, a hospital client this past year, and one of the things that we did in a brainstorming session, took a half a day, is I asked them to sit down and tell me, what are all the content types that you think you publish? And you know what? They were very easily able to make a business-focused list of all of the things that they thought they did. And so, I actually think that figuring out content types can be a fairly straightforward part of a content process. Beyond that, though, organizations have to figure out then what are the attributes of that content type. And I often describe this as what are the fields that are attached to that, or what are the objects attached to it. I worked with Food and Wine magazine just this past year, right here in New York, and we worked through a content model for what their recipes might include. And so you might think, well, recipe, that's a really standard structured content, right? You start with, I don't know, the concept of the recipe at the core. Recipes have ingredients. They have steps attached to them. In this content model, they said, well, we're going to have a category for each recipe, and we're going to have chef attached to each recipe. One of their business focuses is that they were really focused on the people of food, so chef was an important organizing principle. And then we came up with a whole bunch of different facets that would attach to each recipe. So they could categorize the technique used, or the cuisine. Was it German or Greek or Italian? Was it a special diet like gluten-free? Was it appropriate for a holiday like the 4th of July? What methods did it use? Did it require a slow cooker or a pressure cooker? And so you might look at this and go, oh, okay, Karen, well, great. Recipe content model solved, right? But the thing is, this process, this is actually a strategic process that tries to get at the essence of what an organization wants to do. So to contrast, the Lark Cookbook was a Kickstarter-funded project to create a website, a mobile app, and more than that, a printed cookbook that was all derived from the same Drupal-based content management system. And so my friend Jeff Eaton talked to these people and talked about what their content model was. Now, predictably, they started with recipe as well. But below that, even for this incredibly structured content type, what they modeled for their business and their goals was completely different. So for them, the concept of the plate was actually the primary organizing principle. This chef believed that these recipes should all be cooked together in one plate that would have several different items. So the plate was each attached to a particular season. And even more interestingly, this chef believed that there were only 3 seasons. So every plate, every recipe had a season and then a wine varietal that would be attached for the correct season. And then their recipes had steps. Those steps had ingredients attached to them, but they also had techniques, because one of their goals was to create a media library of the chef himself showing people how to perform different techniques if they weren't familiar. And so this, to me, it's like, this is a great example of how challenging it can be to communicate a content model, to break down content from its form, even for something inherently structured. And when you look, like, I don't know about you guys, but for me, when this New York Times innovation report came out, it was like deep throat. And so one of the big smoking gun in the New York Times innovation report for me was when they said that they weren't able to achieve their business goals because they didn't have the right structured data attached to their content. They said the ugly truth about structured data is there are substantial costs to waiting. They go on to say, for example, because our recipes were never properly tagged by ingredients and cooking time, we floundered for about 15 years trying to figure out how to create a useful recipe database. We can do it now, but only after spending a huge sum to retroactively structure the data. Now, to me, this isn't just a problem of what you do with your recipes. To me, this challenge really goes to what sort of data, what sort of stuff do we have blobbed onto web pages that we're not going to be able to get at and reuse more effectively because we don't have the right structured data attached to it. And so to give you an example of this, to give you a real-world scenario here, let me talk about the blobbiest blob that we have ever blobbed onto the web, the PDF. I mean, I feel like generations past us are going to look back and with a sense of shock and horror where they're going to be like, you made a piece of paper that you could look at on a screen? Like, that's how you decided to solve this problem? So I want to be clear before we get started about one very important thing, and it's this. Nobody's reading your PDF. The World Bank recently went through and did an analysis of all of the PDFs that they had published between 2008 and 2012. And what they discovered was that a third of those PDFs had never been downloaded at all by anybody. And 40% of them had been downloaded fewer than 100 times, many of them presumably by the author's mom. And when you start peeling back, it's like, okay, so what's going on in human society where we feel the need to publish a big piece of paper and put it on the web? Ethan and I just went and spent some time working with the people at the Boston Fed. And the Boston Fed, like many research organizations like the World Bank, has multi-page PDFs that just go on, and they've got charts and tables, and they've got equations, and they've got graphs embedded. And you look at this, and you think, what's the workflow that forces somebody to have to create a document like this? Well, it's not digital. I mean, that piece of paper is something that is not information that is stored in what I would call an inherently digital format. It's not responsive. I mean, I work with a lot of banks, maybe some of you do too, and there's no better story to go tell a bank than, hey, all this valuable information that you have locked up in a PDF, it's really not going to render very well on a smartphone. It's not searchable. I mean, there's things you can do, but let's face it, like when people talk about searching the web, they are not talking about finding information that is embedded in PDFs. And it's not accessible. I mean, the tools that we have to create truly accessible content online are stymied by having to use PDFs. And again, there are things that can be done, but a better solution would be to fix the PDF problem. But how do we do that when the root of the PDF problem is not that somebody wants a piece of paper? It's that they have a workflow that allows them to use a familiar tool. They have a very simple process, like the researchers who work at the Federal Reserve Bank or the World Bank. These researchers can use Microsoft Word, save it to PDF, send it to somebody else, and have it instantly appear online. The workflow for creating one of these documents in what is truly digital text would be so much more complicated. They can embed the kind of charts and tables in a way that, yes, you know what, that's just a big graphic. For them to actually embed those charts and tables in a truly digital responsive format, like those are complex content management challenges that simply haven't been solved yet. And I think probably the root of this is that the PDF supports something that all of the content modeling that I've talked about simply doesn't, which is that it supports an unstructured flow of a longer narrative document that has other content types embedded in it at random and unstructured places. My friend Jeff Eaton published something on A List Apart not that long ago, where he called it the battle for the body field, and describes the fact that while many content modeling processes work well for information that is or can be inherently structured, like recipes, they don't provide the tools that are meaningful enough for content creators who need to create a narrative flow. And he says that while standard HTML is rich enough for a designer to represent complex content, it isn't precise enough to describe and store that content in a presentation-independent fashion. What we have here is a mismatch of language. We have a mismatch of vocabulary. And so it requires us to continue relying on tools like the PDF rather than having truly structured content, having workflows and content management technology that will support having digital, accessible, responsive information. So let me talk to you a little bit about what the cost is for our organizations in doing this. I spoke recently to somebody who just completed a redesign for a large professional services company here in New York. And what they did is they went in and they said, we've got a big pile of PDFs. And in researching this, they said, we've got 6,000-ish PDFs that have valuable information in them, and we want to make sure we can get that content out so we can use it in a digital format on our website. And so they went through a process where they started with modeling. So they started by doing exactly what I would describe, where they said, let's try to identify what these content types are, what the attributes of them are, and see if we can get that in a format where we can manage it in our CMS. Then, once they'd done the model, they went back and they looked at some new PDFs in a pilot program. So they said they were essentially testing the model against untested content to make sure that the model stood up and made sense. This process, just to evaluate and create the model, cost them more than $100,000. And this process took about a month. Once they were done with this, then they did the work that I like to call copy and paste, where they went back through, they dug through those 6,000 PDFs. They had a team of people, 3 people working for 5 months to pull the text out of these PDFs and represent it in a meaningful, structured format. That work cost them more than $200,000. And so by the end of it, they'd spent 6 months with a total of 8 people and more than $300,000 to unlock the valuable content that was trapped in these 6,000 PDFs. In comparison to that, they had another 25,000 PDFs that they thought might be interesting information, possibly somebody might want it sometime. It wasn't worth the effort of going through and truly modeling and pulling that content back out of the PDF. So instead, they went through a process that I like to call shoveling. And so they had one developer work for 1 week, and to get those 25,000 PDFs on the internet cost them a bargain of $2,800. And the end result of that is most likely that they have continued the giant dumpster full of documents that no one is ever going to access. I think this is a great case study because it shows the value of creating this kind of structured content starts now. Like the challenge that we face Our future depends on our ability to escape from the blobs. Our future depends on not having content locked up in PDFs, or worse, not having content locked up in unstructured web pages that we're not going to be able to get at in a meaningful way in the future. Our future depends then on having this kind of structured content. And the time to start doing that is now. The New York Times, if they had started 15 years ago, instead of continuing to do things the way they'd always done it, they would be 15 years ahead in their plan to have a recipe database. If these banks or this professional services firm stopped making PDFs now, 10 years from now, when they need to get their content onto audio interfaces or wearable devices, they'll be in a better place. Our future, guys, depends on fighting off the zombies. I guarantee you, if there's one thing that I can promise you, it's that humanity's desire for new technologies and devices and platforms has not yet been sated. There will always be another device, another platform, another screen size, another resolution. Our ability to survive the zombie apocalypse means investing in structured content today.